We're being recorded, everyone, just for posterity. Okay, so why does storytelling matter? Now, I think many of you who are on the phone with me could, or on the line here today, could also give lectures on this. I think in our hearts, we all know why stories matter. Stories are what reach us in our heart, in our gut. As a species, we are a social and storytelling species. It's how we share information. It's how we learn, even down to the fundamentals. Those of you who know about the brain science and babies and brain development, that catch and release, that serve and return of sharing information with one another shapes our brains, shapes our attitudes, shapes our belief. And so the fight that many of us are in, that all of you are in today on behalf of kids and families and working people, and thinking about, how we can, in today's climate, as charged and difficult as it is, make an effective ask for investments in childcare, much needed investments in childcare. Stories are such a critical piece of that. The data are there, they are glaring, they are daunting. Numbers about caseloads, numbers about access, numbers about lack of quality and costs and so on. But all of those are abstractions, and ultimately the power of stories, when combined with data, are really what makes for that possibility of attitude change. They speak to the human condition, obviously, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how they can make abstract and unknown things relatable, particularly when you're trying to change how people think or feel. So, as I mentioned, the ethics of stories are something that I want, that I hope that everybody starts their storytelling or story collecting strategy by exploring. I think right now in our current climate, we have lots of conversations going on about whose voices get heard, about whose stories are told or not told, whose experiences get elevated, and whether others are appropriating stories or appropriating experiences for their own benefit. So we have an immense position of power, and it is a huge privilege to be able to collect stories from others and share them. And that's why I really hope that folks can start by asking themselves and thinking about some of these common concerns, particularly in advocacy mode. I think many of us, when we are out there and we're thinking about the numbers, and we're thinking about, who we need to educate, et cetera, getting stories from people, whether it's families who are using childcare or a provider, it can be easy to for that relationship to become exploitative, where you are using that person's information to advance your advocacy goals, using it in a meeting, getting stuff done, but maybe not giving that person the opportunity to have control over what that story sounds like, looks like, who hears it, under what context, etc. Appropriating, obviously, this is a big issue, particularly with racial dynamics. So, thinking about what the politics are and what the challenges are that are implicit in whether you are telling your own story or someone else's, and contributing to a problem in an effort to fix it. I think being aware of the larger narrative that you're telling stories within, and are you shaping and creating stories and sharing them that can help undo problematic narratives or inadvertently reaffirm them. So that all sounds kind of abstract. We'll get a little more explicit coming up. So what can you do as you are setting out to start your story collecting and sharing strategy? And I have some practical tools that I'm going to share with folks, as well as this presentation and our session here. The first thing that I encourage folks to do when you are using stories in your advocacy strategy is to make sure that you have built relationships with the people you're collecting stories with, even if those relationships are relatively brief, but some way that you have established communication that is two-way, where someone who shares information with you can have the chance to hear more, or I'm sorry, I should stop to say that there will be, oh, for some reason there's some static. I don't know if I have control over that. It's better. If this is still really staticky, can maybe someone flag for me? Comment, chat, something. Still staticky, not staticky. Okay. I am going to go back to my screen here. Let's see. It sounds robotic, huh? Okay. Try turning off my videos. Okay, hold on. Let's see. Oops. Just a moment. Okay, I turned my video off. Any better? Yay! Oh, look at that. There's like a string of things that are much better. Woo! Okay, so, well, you'll get no argument from me. I prefer not having my video on anyway. Okay, so back to the show. Let's see. Hold on. Thank you all for bearing with me. Okay, so what can you do? You can turn your video off, and then you can build some relationships with people as you are collecting stories, as you are sharing them, and we'll talk a little bit more about why. Why are you building relationships? So that as you are using story collecting and sharing in your strategy, you can practice informed consent. So, you know, this is something borrowed from the research field, but, you know, I think it is just equally as important in an advocacy or organizing setting. I have a informed consent form that I am going to give to Jasmine that she can send around. It's a living document I've created with other activists and advocates over the years. And it is the basis of a conversation with someone from whom you would be collecting a story that you might share. It gives them the opportunity to weigh in, not just to what what that story is and what it's all about, but all the pieces of context. So, you know, are you using someone's name or identifying details? But even beyond that, who can you tell that story to? In what contexts? Are they okay with you sharing it? Let's say if you're in a face-to-face meeting with a policymaker or you're giving a talk. It even includes some little details like whether or not, what's the time horizon that that person is okay with you sharing their story. So do you put an expiration date on it? Often when I'm working with youth or you know, younger people, the story that they might tell about themselves or want told about themselves now is not the same that it would be in 5 years. So even just asking someone, you know, is this story okay for me to just keep and use forever? Or would you prefer that I check back in with you in 6 months or a year and maybe have an expiration date on that? And then finally, everyone's favorite bumper sticker from the back of that Volvo, subverting the dominant paradigm. You know, I think right now we are in a moment of tremendous change, I think, around attitudes about race and power and those narratives. And I think when we advance stories, when we give platforms for stories that challenge dominant ways of thinking about things, it is one of the most powerful ways to affect change that there is out there. So, you know, to take it from the less lofty, if you are sitting in front of a fiscally conservative policymaker and you are telling the story, or you have someone with you who's going to tell a story, or you are going to tell a story on their behalf about someone who is using childcare subsidies so that they can support their family and go to work, thinking in advance, what are the attitudes this person may have, and how can I make sure that I'm there with a story that is going to challenge those attitudes.
Hey Beth, it's
Yeah.
Lisa. Sorry to interrupt. You're not sharing your screen anymore, so we just need to get back
Shoot.
to the PowerPoint. No worries. You
Yes.
might want to repeat that because that's a really important point. So maybe repeat that once we get back to the screen.
Okay, let's see if I can share my screen, but also not my video. We're gonna hold on. Here we go.
Ta-da!
Everyone's got it. Look at that. Stories that subvert the
Yeah.
dominant
So
paradigm.
I think it's just the last big point you made is really key. So I mean,
Yes. Thank you, Lisa. See,
of course,
it takes a
takes a
village.
village, y'all. Keep going. All
To
right, I'm
give a
back.
Zoom PowerPoint, it takes a village.
That's right. I'm back on mute.
Yes,
Back to
thank
you.
you. Thank you, dear. And especially so that you don't sound like a robot. So, okay, moving on. And then finally, being prepared for repercussions. So it's sometimes hard. I mean, how do you prepare for the unexpected? Sometimes we start story collecting or gathering efforts, and we don't really think about what might happen when those stories come in. Whether that's an individual who shares their story with you and then has expectations for you. Particularly if that's somebody who is in a position where they don't have a lot of power and you are in a position where you do. I have been an elected official. When I was 30 years old, I was a county commissioner, and I didn't have staff, and I didn't have an office, and I didn't have like an office phone. I had my cell phone, and so my constituents could get right a hold of me if they had a problem, and that was a really incredible way to learn about constituent service. But in understanding when people would bring me their stories, and as even at the time I was an advocate for human services funding, I would often work with my community to try and get stories that I could tell to influence my colleagues. And but I also had to be aware that those are people who have my phone number, and they may continue to have needs from me or come to me because they see me in a position of power. And so how am I going to respond to uncomfortable questions? These types of repercussions can also happen just generally from a story collecting effort. I don't know if folks are familiar with, it's like 20 plus years old at this point. Post Secret was a public art project a guy started where he thought it would be cool to ask people to create postcards and tell a secret and mail them to him. And for a while it was sort of performance art. He would share them, and then he did a series of art installations, and it turned into books, and some of them are incredibly funny. They can be dark, they can be quirky or interesting. And one of the biggest things that happened to the artist was finding that when people had an anonymous platform to share, that suddenly he was hearing stories about people's depression, about their thoughts of self-harm, and that was a really troubling thing to be a repository for. And so he began a partnership with the International Suicide Prevention. There's a wiki now that is available as a partner to the Post Secret community, so that for folks who still want to be a part of this and share their secrets and share their postcards, that there's also an outlet if that sparks feelings or a conversation that that person needs some additional support. So you've now I will pause again to say that one of the other handouts that you'll get accompanying this presentation, along with the informed consent form, is a storytelling strategy guide. It's just one page, but it is a way that you don't have to copy down every word that you're about to see. It walks you through the following types of questions that I encourage folks to ask as they're thinking about collecting and sharing stories in order to achieve advocacy or policy goals. So with everything you do, I and my colleagues encourage you to think about your big picture goal. This isn't necessarily your big picture communications goal, but just generally what you are trying to achieve with your advocacy efforts. You know, what is the change that you want to see in the world? And then to think, you know, okay, this 6 months, this legislative term, the next year, what concrete step, what's my measurable objective? So many of you are familiar with this kind of thinking, you know, starting with your strategy and your objective. But when you are thinking about stories as a tactic, then it's important to understand where you're starting from with these pieces, because it'll shape the types of stories you're gathering and from whom you are soliciting them. So, you know, the next obvious questions in any communication strategy: who are you trying to reach? And getting as specific in your minds as you can about those audiences. Who are they? What do they care about? What are they afraid of? What barriers might they have in their attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs? And how might stories spur them to take action in some way? Now, kind of a deeper set of questions that I encourage people to think about with the story piece of your strategy is then to also think about narrative, bigger picture narrative. You know, whose voices do you need in this story? And it is important, again, to think about whose voices are currently in the narrative and whose are not. What experiences do you want to lift up? Are there particular aspects of people's experiences that might not be obvious to those who are in power? And, you know, how can you use human experience and stories to help shift attitudes? So doing some thinking up front about what are some of those beliefs that people may have, because stories work at the level of people's beliefs and they work at that emotional level. What are the ones that you're going to be trying to tackle, and how are stories possibly helpful to that? So then you start getting, then we get to the practical details. How are you going to collect these stories? You know, am I in a position to do it? So, you know, do you have clients you serve directly, or an organization that you serve where you serve people directly? And if not, who is a trusted partner in your network that might have access to others who would be willing to share their stories? You know, how can you put the word out that you are looking, whether that's on a website, via social media, or through word of mouth? You know, these are often important questions to ask if you are looking to gather stories from people who are marginalized or oppressed or might not want to come forward. So, you know, I've worked in story collection efforts with people who are undocumented, or people who are experiencing intimate partner violence. So, you know, understanding how a trusted network can be a really vital piece of sourcing stories and establishing your credibility as someone who could be trusted. So from that weighty topic, I wanted to just spend a few minutes going over some of the core components of great stories. So now you have all these amazing people and you know they have amazing stories to tell. It doesn't mean you're done, right? So good stories not only have some core components, they often take practice, they take some shaping, they take thought about what goes in and what doesn't, because there's nothing worse than sitting with someone who's telling a rambling story and you know it has some important information in it, but it's taking a while to get there. So just a reminder, in case it's been a while since your 8th grade English class, the essentials of a good story. You need a character, and that could be an individual, it could be a group. They need to be up against some kind of conflict, and we need some kind of resolution. So obviously there's a big conflict right now that many of the characters we work with are dealing with. Access to high quality childcare and the money to pay for it. And there's no resolution. So what do we do? Or there's coronavirus and we don't have a good resolution about how providers are supposed to open safely and care for children. That's okay. The space between conflict and resolution is tension, and that's what hooks your audience. So as you are telling stories, you can leave something unresolved if you bring that person into the narrative and say they could be part of getting to that resolution, right? So their action is what will get us to the end, right? Humans of New York, I can only imagine all of you are familiar with it. It's one of my favorite story gathering efforts. Just some reminders of what takes a story from being okay to being really great. Brevity. So, like I said, rambling stories are a big bummer, and they also lose the emotional impact because folks can't follow the narrative thread. So that means a beginning, a middle, and an end. It also means details. So whether you're using real names or not, adding just some basics like a name or an age or a background, a curly haired little girl, whatever it is, some of those little details can make it feel much less abstract, and they start kind of hitting that part of our brain that is hungry for narrative. A setting, so grounding in a space and time. And then finally, a link to those universal human experiences. So no matter who we are, there are certain things that we all share: a need for love, a desire for belonging, those sorts of things. Tapping into, concerns we have as parents, or concerns about being able to make ends meet. Those sorts of human universal types of things are a great way to establish a connection between your storyteller or the subject of your story and your audience. So finally, some archetypes. So there are many. If you Google story archetypes, there are a zillion different types. These are the types of stories that get told and retold. I have a handful that I share with advocates as they're out there in their work, because I think they are especially illustrative. They're helpful, particularly for a campaign or an organization to be able to tell for themselves or about themselves, because they kind of establish you in the world, and knowing how you would answer these sorts of questions is a really good way to know that you have kind of thought about your core identity as an effort, or what your foundational principles are. So you can see them on the screen. Things like the nature of our challenge. What are you up against? What kind of hero are you? What, as an organization or as a campaign, what are you out there trying to solve? The creation story of where you came from. This is one that can be helpful with something like a donor, but might not be all that interesting to, let's say, a policymaker who you are lobbying. So knowing that having different types of stories in your pocket are good for different purposes and different audiences is really important. An emblematic success. So what does victory look like? And it doesn't have to be, a massive influx of funds, though that's always nice, or the passage of a policy. It could be something as simple as a family having a place to sleep for the night who didn't have one the night before. So really kind of making it very clear and concrete what winning means. For coalitions, and I know all of you are parts of probably multiple different types of coalitions, the difference that having partners makes is a really nice one to be able to tell. More of an internal, or for internal audiences / supporters or prospective funders, but is a nice thing to be able to actually have thought through. And then finally, the bigger picture of your emblematic success, what transformation looks like. So, really trying to sit down and think about stories you have that make clear the different future that you are trying to build toward. So how will you share all these wonderful stories? The stories are if a story falls in the forest, does it make a sound? There are lots of different opportunities for packaging, and we have subsequent webinars that we're going to share around how you actually take the raw material of stories and turn it into stuff. But you can find them enlivening people's websites, whether that's through words or images. They might be an opener or a hook in an op-ed. Social media, obviously sharing them there can be great. The social media, different channels are great for soliciting stories. You all have seen things like Humans of New York, where the story in and of itself, story sharing and gathering is the purpose. Videos, that, you know, whether that is actually like a narrative or a video slideshow. Lots of other different packaging options here, like a storybook. And then obviously in those, you know, one-on-one meetings or in a presentation that someone might share, where you might actually be sharing somebody else's story. I have a good example of coming up of one of the fun ways that we had thought about packaging when I was working on a very serious campaign about 6 years ago now, just as the Supreme Court was making the decision around the Defense of Marriage Act, and we still had a faint hope of comprehensive immigration reform. I was working with a coalition of LGBTQ advocates who were trying to elevate the issues of the queer community within immigration reform, because there is a whole special layer of challenges for LGBTQ folks within the immigrant and undocumented community. And so one of the things that we did in collecting people's stories around the holiday time was send out holiday cards, e-cards, that just had a photo and a snippet of someone's story. The holidays are a time when we all want to be together. And so thinking about families being separated from one another or unsafe at holiday time is an especially tough thing to imagine. And so, you know, this was a chance to take some of those great stories that we've collected and use them on a broader platform, and also, you know, kind of have a little snapshot that then can carry a larger message. So I feel like that is 30 straight minutes of talking, or 25 thereabouts, give or take technical difficulties. This is a conversation that I love to have with people. So I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for folks to ask questions or share their own experiences in story collecting, the ethics of it, how you have tackled some of these challenges, et cetera. So I believe that we can accept questions and comments and such by chat. And I am trying to get to the chat function, since I don't know that I can actually see all of your lovely faces. But I'd welcome questions or thoughts, reactions, concerns, etc.
And Beth, this is Lisa. I'm not sure if everyone has the ability to unmute their own lines, or if that's just us, but if folks do, we're happy to take questions that way as well.
Yes. I think Jasmine had said something about it had to be via chat, but I'd be happy to hear your voices as well.
And Beth, while folks are formulating some questions, if they have some, I would love to hear you speak a little. You talked back at the beginning about kind of taking a step back from just, oh, we need to collect stories, to the why are we collecting stories? You know, what are we trying to achieve? And therefore, what kinds of stories do we need to collect? Can you talk a little bit more about, you know, can you kind of walk through an actual example, maybe with a grantee you're working with, or where it's, okay, if this is what we're trying to achieve, therefore, who are we reaching? Therefore, who do they need to hear from? Just so we can kind of hear that linear thought that plays into it.
Sure. So I won't put any of the grantees that I'm working with right now on the spot, but we can kind of do an amalgam, since I think many of the folks on the phone share a common advocacy goal, right? So right now, in the context of coronavirus, as federal unemployment is ending, and we need to reach federal policymakers to try to get them to increase investments, let's say in the next stimulus. So let's say we have the opportunity to have a meeting with one of our a congressional delegation. You know that you need to ask them for money, and your organization as an advocate, you have the relationship where you can organize a meeting. If I were you, I would be thinking about identifying constituents from that member of Congress's district. And as I was thinking about who those people were and what types of stories I would be looking to source and share, I think about, all right, so this member of Congress, are they, obviously there's basics like their party, but what else can I find out? Is this someone who is conservatively minded? And they really, mostly what they want to know is, or mostly what's going to be influential to them is, I want to know that everybody's getting back to work as soon as they can. Then I would be trying to source stories that could help show why affordable, accessible childcare is essential for somebody to be able to get back to work, and that in the absence of it, that person is, or their family are, they might be forced to choose between quitting and caring for their kids. So, being able to tell a story like that then illustrates the larger economic repercussions. You could think about it from the vantage point of a small business owner who has multiple employees that rely on childcare. Could I find a small business person who could come in and say, look, I'm only able to do my business because the servers who work here at my restaurant have access to this local childcare. I know that they are folks that aren't making a ton of money and they need that extra subsidy to make ends meet. So look, my business runs because I have them here able to do their jobs every day. And if I can't count on them, then I'm in trouble. So, again, it's thinking from who the person is. Okay, I have let's say a more fiscally minded decision maker. What are these different voices that could be helpful and influential to them? I might not just lead with one that is, however sad, a story about a single mom or someone who has multiple kids and is just one that more tugs on the heartstrings. This gets to that question of, am I reinforcing, negative attitudes that someone has? However much we might be able to contextualize or understand the choices someone makes and their life circumstances, I don't want to bring in there just knowing the way the world works. I don't want to bring in someone who would be judged or who the person I might be meeting with would think, well, this is just a perfect example of why, I don't want to make that kind of investment because I don't want to further this type of stuff. So it's just making that connection between what you can figure out about your audience and what will be persuasive to them, and who among the community of people you touch can you identify that can help tell stories that will change hearts and minds.
Thank you, Beth. Do we have any other questions via chat or unmuted?
Oops, sorry. That's me playing with the mouse. Lisa, is there, since I have the benefit of you not only to check me on my technology issues, are there, from your experiences, are there other elements of the kind of ethical pieces around story collecting or sharing that you feel like are important to emphasize for folks?
No, I don't think so. I think you covered it beautifully at the beginning, and I was doing a time check. I was going to say, I'm happy to give folks back some time on for some, at least East Coasters, a later Thursday afternoon. I definitely encourage folks to look at your ethical storytelling worksheet. I forget what you're calling it, Beth, but it really helps lay out some of those questions and things to be mindful of and how to make sure you're collecting those stories in the most ethical way possible, for sure.
Okay, so so like I said, I have these two handouts that you will be getting from Jasmine. One is going to be a story planner, and one is going to be an informed consent form. When you get the consent form, don't feel like you need to use I think it's like 2 full pages, so it's really more there as something to spark your own thinking, and potentially to use as a conversation document. I also can't let you all go without doing a story, without telling a story, because I'd be, that seems wrong, right? So I don't know whether a few years ago, any of you who are on the East Coast might have seen, there was a mom who wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post in the parenting section about having a little girl who really couldn't stand girly clothes. And any of us who have shopped at the Gap, particularly for children, has seen that sometimes they'll have some pretty objectionable, mommy's little shopper types of things, lots of hearts and flowers. And this mom had a kid who really was not into the girly stuff, and was asking why the boys section had things that were better. And so she writes this essay about it to the Washington Post, and the Post prints the letter, which I will show all of you here, from this 5.5-year-old who, he has a message for the CEO of the Gap about the types of clothes that are available in the girls section versus the boys section, and how she would like some cooler shirts for girls, or maybe even just a no boys or girls section at all, just a kids section. So the mom waits, the family waits weeks and weeks, and there's no answer from the Gap. And then finally, I guess the Gap is able to track the family down using LinkedIn. And so a few weeks later, an email arrives in the inbox of the mom, and it comes from none other than Jeff Kerwin, CEO of the Gap, who says, dear Alice, apparently writing to the little girl, platitude, the Gap, we celebrate everybody, and, we're so glad about independent spirits. But then in the middle of the email, he actually says, you are right, we can do better. And so mom reads this email to the little girl and says, do you know what he is saying, right? You wrote a letter to him and said that what they were doing was really bad, and do you get what his answer was? And she says, yeah, he said I'm right. And so the mom writes another op-ed in the Washington Post saying, we heard back. And next thing you know, this little story goes completely viral, and all of the business media take off, right? They freak out because, it's one of those great man bites dog stories about a 5-year-old who writes to the Gap and, has the right message. And next thing you know, they are actually changing some of the shirts and making some different options. So that little girl is my daughter, Alice. And I tell this story because it was the ultimate experience for me as a communicator in understanding how important consent was, and understanding repercussions, both the ones you can expect and the ones that you can't. So before we sent our letter to the Gap, I asked Alice, are you okay if this gets printed in the newspaper? And she said she was okay with it. And I said, the newspaper wants your picture. And she said, no, I do not want my picture in it. And from there, the flood of media that we got as a result of this communication, everything from, the Today Show, you name it, everybody, we had crazy offers coming from people, and everyone wanted to see her picture. And I asked Alice, and she said no. And so I told her that I was giving a talk to advocates, and that I wanted to tell her story because I thought it was such a powerful story of how just one person, even a little person, can make a difference if they are the right person to take the message to the right person at the right time. And I said, do you mind if I show people your picture? And she said that's okay, because she doesn't mind if it's to people who are also trying to change things and make the world better too. So this is her picture, and this is her story. And I tell it to all of you to encourage you that sometimes we are up against really big things and we are really small. And yet, if you are persistent and if you catch your moment and you have the right message of what the right thing is to do, you can make things different. And
that was wonderful, Beth. We have some thank yous in the chat box. Yeah, I think everybody appreciates what a great story that is. So thank you, Beth.
All right. Well, thank you everybody so much. It has been a pleasure getting to talk with all of you. I will stop my screen sharing and we will follow up. We have another webinar, I think. Lisa, do you remember the date?
Oh, of course not. It's in late July, everybody. We're doing these, I think, every third Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern. And we will send out a schedule, and Jasmine is helping us get, and Deb is helping us get these all on your calendar. So much more to come.
Okay, great. So we are looking forward to continuing the conversation with all of you. In the meantime, you can reach us through Jasmine, and we wish you all the greatest of good fortune using this powerful tool. Thank you so much. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.